The form of Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah is most famous for its speculation on the nature of the divine emanations, a series of 10 moments of the divine coming to be, which are also essential aspects of all of reality itself. Those 10 emanations are Sefirot, are echoed and mirrored down through all levels of reality, a fractal matrix of being and becoming. While the concept of the Sefirot was more or less settled early on in the development of Kabbalah, the doctrine settling into pretty profound cohesion by the compositions of the mammoth Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, in the latter half of the 13th century, another theosophical debate raged on for centuries thereafter: the nature and origin of evil. Those debates would take a wide variety of forms before themselves settling into what has become the standard theory of evil in Kabbalah as most of us know it, that is, the Kabbalah developed by Itzhak Luria, the Ari. In the theory of the breaking of the vessels, the demonic husks or shells known as the Klippot, and the generation of an impure, evil, inverse reality of the Sefirot, known simply as Sitra Achra, or the other side. It's the Jewish upside down. But how did speculation around the origin and nature of evil develop in Kabbalah in the first place? What are the origins of the Klippot and the horrible Sitra Achra? Let's survey the wide range of speculations to find that evil in Kabbalah may very well have its origins in the divine itself, in a kind of primordial void, or as an ontologically malevolent shell which precedes the fruit of being itself. Also, this video is a collaboration with my dear friend and colleague Dr. Angela Puca, an expert in contemporary occultism. You're gonna want to make sure to check out her fantastic video where she'll be describing contemporary occult and left-hand path magic inspired by the concept of the Klippot. Absolutely go over to check out Angela's channel, make sure to subscribe to her content, and tell her I said hi. But stick around here. Make sure to subscribe also to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you want to support work like this, providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon and some of the merch on the channel. If you're new to the study of Western esotericism and you want to kind of get your sea legs, esoteric legs, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out my website, Esoteric Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment, including a link to Dr. Angela Puca's channel. But now, let's turn to the origins of evil in the Kabbalah. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The origins of chaos and evil have been the subject of religious and philosophical speculation since such speculation has been put to writing, and probably very long before the likely fad that is civilization ever reared its head. Many of those speculations are found in the collection of Israelite literature known as the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. The origins of evil have also fascinated early Judaism and Christianity, and a wide range of etiologies or origin stories of evil have been offered by theologians, mystics, and philosophers through the ages. From a radical monotheism where God alone is responsible for all things, including evil, the rapacious desires of angelic beings for the women of earth, a pride-inspired great revolt of angels led by Satan against God, or the introduction of evil by the violation of the first commandment in Adam's tasting of the forbidden fruit, a wide varieties for the origins of evil were lively topics of discussion in the first few centuries of the Common Era. However, Christianity pretty quickly settled on a very specific set of myths to anchor its theory of evil. Those myths, of course, in the service of the soteriological coming of Jesus. Judaism, on the other hand, continued to wrestle with those questions for centuries, and with no central theological authority, there's no Jewish Pope, Baruch Hashem, a truly wide variety of speculations emerged. Those speculations, perhaps informed with encounters with Zoroastrian theologies in Persia, would reach a truly stunning array in the speculative Kabbalah that took shape in France and Spain in the early Middle Ages. But before turning to that range of Kabbalistic speculations on the origins and nature of evil, it's worth exploring the more fundamental matrix, the scriptural and historical substructure that actually anchored much of that very speculation. This is a tradition existed in which God was responsible for evil. God was fundamentally responsible for evil, and this is a position born out of the kind of radical monotheism or monotheistic rhetoric of texts like Isaiah 45:7, in which God famously declares, "I form the light and create darkness. I produce peace and evil." Or at a text like Lamentations 3:38, where we read that out of the mouth of the Most High did not good and evil proceed? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is yes, good and evil did proceed. Further, the famous "a time for X and a time for Y" of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet 3 also indicate that the divine is responsible for all those times, those of weal and of woe, those of good and evil. And other sections of the Hebrew Bible, like the scapegoat for a potential demonic being Azazel in the Yom Kippur temple liturgy, also seem to hint at some kind of primordial, quasi-evil divine being that needs to be appeased. The mysterious but widely accepted Sefer Yetzirah, a mystical text detailing the formation of the Olam, or the universe, out of the divine speech, also seems to indicate that God has forged both good and evil, as we read, and God made the states of opposition, good and evil, good from the good and evil from the evil. Finally, a famed midrash, a mytho-poetic exegesis of the Bible attributed to Rabbi Tanhuma, who is an early 4th century scholar of the Common Era, that is, hints at a surprising aspect of the history of our cosmos, of this world. That this world, the one that we're currently inhabiting, it wasn't the first. In fact, others had come before and were destroyed by the divine because they displeased God for various reasons. At least in those early texts, we don't really learn why they displeased God, but speculations on previous worlds would flourish in Kabbalistic discussions on the origins of evil. Thus, the matrix of such speculations on the origins and nature of evil in Kabbalah are centered on a handful of elements. Biblical and rabbinical texts focusing on evil, especially impurity and malevolent beings and characters such as, well, demons like Ashmedai, or Lilith for that matter, or murderous evil people like Cain. Secondly, there's just the historical reality of Jewish existence, an existence, well, that was all cheery and nothing ever bad happened. No, it's one, of course, marked by tragedy, oppression, and, the destruction of the temple and things. Finally, there are more specifically metaphysical speculations on the nature of evil, which arose from mystical, philosophical, and religious speculation just more generally, outside of biblical concerns. All of this, given the cradle that much of rabbinical Judaism occurred in Sasanian Persia. Remember, we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud, but we should really talk about the Persian Talmud before spreading to the wider Jewish world. Thus, some degree of Zoroastrian influence, maybe Zervanism, is likely here, but it's often obscure. Now, I'll be coming back to those possible Zoroastrian or Zervanistic influences in an episode all on its own, so hold on to this idea. But to quickly come back to this question of philosophical speculations on the nature of evil, while much Kabbalistic speculation will eventually hypostasize evil, which is just a fancy philosophical way of saying they thought evil was metaphysically real and thus it had substantial status, ontological status we would say in philosophy, most Jewish philosophers just rejected that position out of hand. Maimonides, a pretty radical Aristotelian, primarily understood evil, a bit like Augustine in the Christian tradition, as a lack, as a privation, a metaphysical lack of inexistence, in the same way that cold or darkness don't really exist. Others, more Neoplatonically inspired philosophers like Ibn Latif, speculated actually very little on the nature of evil. They just didn't seem to care. But they also understood it as a kind of privation associated with the imperfection of matter, or hule, rather than being evil as a metaphysically substantial thing. Some even went so far as to say that evil was just the influence of an astral being like Saturn. It was just Saturn emitting astral rays down here that caused things to go badly. It had nothing to do with fundamental philosophical or mystical questions at all. It was just astrological weather. However, it's important to note that Kabbalah was often very self-consciously a rejection of those kinds of speculations. It was a kind of anti-philosophy in some ways, especially the rather deflationary Aristotelian metaphysics of someone like Maimonides, and thus it isn't that surprising that whereas Maimonides would go for a metaphysically minimalist position, Kabbalah, they're a big nope on minimalism of any kind. Kabbalah would exult in positively Baroque maximalism, including evil maximalism? That sounds dangerous. That said, speculations about evil in early Kabbalah generally take three distinct forms. A naturalistic mode in which evil is said to emerge prior to goodness, either as a kind of primordial ontological void, by the emergence of evil as a kind of condition for the possibility of the existence of goodness itself. Those speculations center around the Kabbalistic dictum that the shell precedes the fruit. We'll come back to this in a good bit in a minute. Another line of speculation is the sort of greater harmony or perfectionist line in which good and evil must exist both at the same time in order for there to be any existence at all. This is kind of like a Leibnizian best of all possible worlds business. And thus the presence of evil is necessary for the perfection of the wider universe. This is an extension of the radical monotheism discussed earlier, whereby good and evil are brought into being by God as an essential aspect of the creation of the cosmos. It's like you needing a symphony where everything's there, but if you just heard one instrument at a time, it'd sound terrible. God hears all the instruments, we don't. Finally, there is the evolutionary or cathartic model by which the coming to be of evil is simply part of the evolution of the divine and the creation of the universe as well. In this line of speculation, evil is a kind of dross or refuse, a kind of trash thrown off in the process of the divine coming to be and or the creation of the cosmos. Most early Kabbalists will follow one, several, or all of these forms of speculation until they're really systematized by Isaac Luria in the 16th century, becoming, as you probably know, the myth of the breaking of the vessels, the coming to be of the demonic shards of creation, that's the Klippot, and the generation of the evil and impure side of the Sefirot, the other side, the Sitra Achra, from the Sefirah, specifically Gevura or Din, divine wrath, unchecked by the Sifra of Chesed. But to appreciate those Lurianic concepts, indeed concepts that most simply recognize just as Kabbalah simplicator, we need to understand the centuries of development that led to the Kabbalah as we understand it now. You're not going to really appreciate those ideas in Lurianic Kabbalah fully if you don't understand the fact that they're the product of an evolution of ideas, and that evolution is itself fantastically interesting, in my opinion. An early strata of Kabbalistic speculations on evil, which are actually reflected in Christian speculations about Jewish belief, like those reflected in the 9th century Archbishop of Lyon, Agabar, who indicates that Jews at that time believed that the divine good and bad thoughts, the thoughts of the divine, actually gave rise to angels and demons respectively. It also seems to indicate for Jews at that time that the first evil arose in the divine mind before flowing out as a kind of ontological substance in the emanation of reality. The 13th century Rabbi Joseph Hamadan, whose name actually may indicate Persian origin, and that's another hint at all these possible Zoroastrian, Zervanistic connections, we'll come back to those, seemingly agrees with this line of speculation such that the pure thoughts in the divine mind become an angel, while the divine mind contemplating calamity, which is also maybe a translation of Ra, forged demons, specifically the Damager demons, the Mazakin of the Talmud, and of course the famous Lilith, the Lilene demons. Importantly, these angels and demons seem to appear respectively on the right and the left side of the divine mind, whatever right and left mean inside of a mind, but that's an important bit of metaphysical geography, as we'll see in a bit. The left, or the side of divine evil and impurity, is also understood by the 13th century Rabbi Moshe de Leon, not a small character in all this, as the origins of the commandments for the biblical sacrifices. Thus, the killing and burning of animals especially is meant to satisfy the malevolent regions of the divine mind, just as acts of loving kindness satisfy the right-hand side of the divine mind. Of course, as my Kabbalah nerds know, De Leon would play a pivotal, though not the only, role. That's a very important development in scholarship in the composition of the Sefer Zohar, the Book of Radiance, the most important text in the whole history of Kabbalah. And, unsurprisingly, we find just such an idea very obscurely developed in the Zohar itself. There, the Botzina de Cardinuta, the lamp of darkness, or the first occulted light, which is the initial impulse of the divine will, strikes the divine thought, which throws off a shower of sparks, but also somehow purifies the divine mind of some kind of primordial refuse. This is the primeval pasolet, the dross or trash even of the mind. This initial clash seems to create a higher thought and a lower one, or a right and a left one, and thus generates evil in some sense as we know it. The shower of sparks is a divine residue or refuge, the pasolet. Even more esoteric sections of the Zohar, which is a thing, especially the Idrazuta, link this moment with an even more primordial period of the divine existence. There, the divine underwent some kind of symmetry collapse, rotating in upon itself, creating and destroying worlds and throwing off sparkles, or zikin, also throwing off divine sparks, or nitzotzin, in the tremendous process of becoming, until the divine became oriented face to face, throwing off a final fiery residue and generating the Sefirot and our cosmos, along with evil. Admittedly, these passages, with their profound sexual ontology, are among the most obscure and the most mysterious in an already difficult text, and frankly they remain so to this day. Single lines of the Zohar in these sections get pages and pages and pages of mystical commentary in the literature, and 30 seconds of explanation ain't going to do it. Another line of speculation, or perhaps lines of speculation, is that evil is an expression of an inverse realm of the 10 emanations of the divine, an inverse Sefirot. These evil Sefirot are sometimes in the earliest sections referred to as a Temura, or a counterpart, and thus this Sefira as an inverse Sefirot, or denoted as the Temurot. This might be a kind of pun on Tuma, the Hebrew word for impure, or impurity. Exactly where this Olam HaTemurot, or world of the Tumurot, is varies a lot. Sometimes it's all said to be contained in the Sefira of Keter, other have it generated from the backside of Gevurah, and other have it kind of as an inverse upward growth from Malchut. Regardless, such a concept is a prototype for what would later become the Sitra Achra. However, the Olam HaTemurot is also linked with an equally obscure Kabbalistic concept, that of the 10 kings of Edom, who ruled before a king ruled Israel. This otherwise innocuous, completely passable verse at Genesis 36:31 was long taken as a hint, or a remez, of a more profound ontological process, far more important than just a list of ancient Near East kings. In this interpretation, the 10 kings of Edom are the metaphysical 10 Tumurot, the Klippot of later Kabbalah, who existed before the emanation of the 10 Sefirot. Not only that, but they were previous worlds. They were previous universes that were created and destroyed and became a kind of refuse, or pasolet. That's literally the modern Hebrew word for trash, one after the other, like a stack of evil pancakes, and upon which the world of purity was just barely able to be constructed. So our universe is a bit like a city built atop a landfill composed of the trash of all those worlds that came before. Yeah, we're living in the metaphysical equivalent of Staten Island. Sorry, Staten Island. In other lines of speculation, the Tumurot are simply the backsides of the Sefirot, just as a person in transition from a state of Tahara, purity, to a state of impurity, Tuma. So the Sefirot can be said to contain both as logical correlatives. On the more philosophical side of the spectrum is a rather strange line of speculation in which Aristotelian concepts are actually hypostasized as if they were Platonic forms, something that would cause both Aristotle and Plato to roll in their graves. Specifically, the Aristotelian concepts of potentiality, actuality, and privation, or steresis. All of these are rendered into ontological elements of the primordial divinity. Early variants of this thinking, such as the 12th century Rabbi Jacob ben Reuven, have good and evil tracked to actuality and potentiality, specifically steresis themselves, such that both are required for the generation and corruption of the entire universe, of the entire Olam. However, in the early Kabbalah of Girona and Catalonia, potentiality becomes linked with negativity or pure nothingness, afisa or ayin, such that the first light of let there be light, yahi or, is born out of a more primordial darkness, emptiness or void, which is ontologically a rich privation, as strangely contradictory as that might first appear and frankly just might be. It's nothingness as a something. This afisa is an Aristotelian steresis, or privation, rendered metaphysically real, a lack made precisely in its lackness a something. This limitless, endless nothingness becomes the tohu of Genesis and Rabbi Azrael of Girona, from which a bohu, or void, a somehow less negative nothingness, in that it is bounded at least, is the structure into which light is drawn forth, leaving behind the tohu as pasolet, as refuse. You can begin to see how these ideas are being merged together. The metaphor employed to describe this process is actually a pun taken from Hebrew, where the flour, or the solet, is taken from the chaff or waste, the pesolet. Thus, out of the primordial chaff comes the wheat, and hence the famed Kabbalistic dictum that the shell precedes the fruit. But an even more esoteric dimension attends this very speculation. Not only does the pure steresis, or privation of the shell, ontologically precede the fruit, metaphysical chaff before the wheat, but it's precisely the violent evil of the chaff, of that tohu, that protects the wheat or fruit from the evolution of the system itself. Remember those 10 worlds that have come before. Thus, the evil primordial period was necessary precisely to protect the seedling Sefirot during the birth and death of those prior 10 worlds, before the 10 emanations of the divine could unfold as our world. Again, the pasolet of darkness and evil becoming the foundations for the psolet, the life-giving wheat of our reality. As Kabbalah began to take shape in Spain, especially in Castile, focus on the origins and nature of evil took an even more frantic and speculative dimension. From absolutely dizzying texts like the treatise on the emanations of the left-hand side, which I've covered in a previous episode, to more specifically philosophical treatments, the Kabbalists of Castile did more to contemplate evil than I think any Kabbalists before or since. The focus of these texts is often upon the process that we've hinted at earlier, whereby purity is achieved through impurity, mizohama didehava nefak. In Aramaic, it means something like to emerge from the filth of gold, the rubbish of gold. In these cases, the process is likened to how Cain and Esau gave rise to Abel and Jacob, as dross is purged by the silversmith, as garbage is purged from a stately house, or as waste is excreted from the human being. These forces of primeval tuma, or impurity, are forged as necessary parts of the divine coming to be in the creation of the Sefirot and the cosmos as such. But just as the blows of the blacksmith's hammer throws off sparks of waste to forge metal, so too does the violence of becoming throw off waste, pesolet, dross, and out of the impurity of all of that emerges the pure world, the Sefirot, the shells or husks preceding the fruit. There is a sense in these texts, however, that our world, the final world after the 10 worlds of impurity, the so-called kings of Edom, is just so barely beyond the world of evil impurity. So close is our realm to those that sickness, foulness, death, and the source of ritual impurity, or tuma, constantly threaten our world. In fact, the Torah itself was given in part, according to the text of this period, to appease to appease those forces of impurity. As I mentioned earlier, the biblical sacrifices appease such forces that otherwise threaten to overwhelm our tiny little holdout of light and life. Further, the negative commandments, the thou shalt nots, are directly commanded in order that we not empower the forces of Tumah, the Olam Timorot, what will become the Sitra Achra. When one violates those commandments, it's as if one is taking garbage back from the street and just tossing it all over your house, or adding dross back to pure gold. The purgation of the pasolet, the detritus of coming to be, has simply played its role and only serves to infect our realm with ontological tumah. And thus the commandments are about separating the worlds from the world of tumah to the world of tahara, the world of purity in our realm. All of these lines of speculation would eventually converge in the Safetian center at Tzfat, the crucible in which Kabbalah, as we know it, would come to be forged. The existence of primeval privation, impurity, and purgation as an act of divine perfection via the formation of the Sefirot in the cosmos would come there to be radically systematized. In as early as 1545, such systematizing texts would emerge, but it would be in the works of Shlomo Alkabetz, Joseph Caro, and Moshe Cordovero, my hero, that would set the stage for the final synthetic development of the breaking of the vessels, the Klippot, and the Sitra Achra. In the writings of these three great titans of Kabbalah, Ziyah, all three lines of speculation on the origins and nature of evil come together, though they are often discussed purely speculatively, though as strongly received traditions in Alkabetz and Cairo. In fact, the Mishnah made angelic teacher, the Maggid, yes, the Mishnah is transformed into a kind of disembodied angelic teacher in this period, this known as the Maggid. This Maggid expounds to Alkabetz and Cairo how the shell precedes the fruit. It is hinted at in scripture as to why the holy, tahara, and the impure, the tumah, are mixed in our world, but distinct in the supernal divine realms and in the demonic reaches of the concrete darkness. Because they are mixed in our realm, the task of human beings is to fully separate, to sift through the world of tumah, impurity that infects our world, through the engagement with Kabbalistic theurgy. Hence the development of so many Kabbalistic rituals at this time, including the most famous of all, the Friday evening Kabbalah Shabbat service, developed precisely by Alkabetz and Cairo. They develop theurgy as a kind of sifting tool to separate our worlds from the world of tumah and the world of tahara, so that we become part of the tahara, pulling down the purity of the supernal realms. But it would be Moshe Cordovero, the greatest of the systematizers of Kabbalah, in my opinion, that will bring together all these strings together, but not, for whatever reason, he wouldn't tie them. In his vast literary output, Cordovero would introduce and develop nearly every line of speculation for the origins and nature evil that we've discussed so far. However, always with a more philosophical rather than mythological bent. Well, nearly always. The fact that Cordovero is thought of as more philosophical than mythological has been overstated. For instance, in his discussion of the primeval no-thingness, the nothingness, he links that void to a kind of pure potentiality of thought, which is then expurgated via the eternality of divine activity being thought thinking itself in the classic Aristotelian sense. God's primeval knowledge of the Sefirot as potentialities does constitute a sense of a world before being, but that world is purged as mental refuge through the process of emanation of just those potential Sefirot as actual Sefirot, just as the mental note is forgotten when the task is actually completed. This trend is typical of Cordovero. Previously, more mythological elements are reinterpreted within a more specifically philosophical framework. I also think this is why Luria ultimately won over Cordovero. I think people often just like grandiose myths in their religion as opposed to critical philosophy. It's also why I think Maimonides didn't win. However, Cordovero does by no means abandon the language of mythopoesis, especially in the language of the intersexual polarity in the generation of the Sefirot. There, the hidden male and female rise and fall within the occult light of Keter, mercy and judgment tossing and turning in violent sexual delight before bursting out in ecstasy of the Sephirotic reality. Cordovero also retains the concept of the shell preceding the fruit, though he places that process much later in the ontological development of reality, down in the Sefirot of Malchut, down in our realm, to explain the existence of evil prior to goodness. The Shadim are demons prior to the souls of the righteous on the Shabbat, Cain before Abel, the flawed kings of Israel before the good ones, the rule of Edom prior to that of the Messiah. Of course, all of this vast and wonderful machinery would be brought to bear on the greatest mythological development in all of Jewish theological and mystical history, that of the system of Isaac Luria, the Arizal. It's just Kabbalah, basically. And with his myth of the breaking of the vessels, the Klippot and the Sitra Achra from the Sefirot of Gevurah, and the theological process of redemption through Tikkun Ulam, Luria would forge Kabbalah as all of us know it, rolling all of this into one vast, baroque, and sometimes incoherent system. Though Luria did by no means forge his system from nothing, it was the result of a complex and amazing history of philosophical and mystical speculation, a history well worth studying on its own for all kinds of profound insights. And if you want to dive into those texts as much as one can in English, basically nothing of this is translated from Hebrew with a few exceptions. Nearly all of this material remains in Hebrew, unfortunately. Sholom's essays on evil and Kabbalah, on the mystical shape of the Godhead, still one of the best places to start, frankly. And Tishby's wonderful The Doctrine of Evil and the Shell in Lurianic Kabbalah has actually finally gotten an expensive English translation. It's like $80 if you can find it. But it's a magisterial text, and it's just sort of ground floor for this kind of information. Edel's Primaeval Evil in Kabbalah is also just breathtaking scholarship, and this episode is profoundly indebted to the work of Moshe Edel. That's a great book and well worth checking out. But don't forget to check out Dr. Angela Puca's companion video focusing on how all of this business of the Klippot has actually been reimagined and reinvented in some sense to be used in sort of modern contemporary cult practices of the left-hand path in the form of Qliphothic magic. So that's fascinating stuff in the contemporary period, well worth checking out. Again, head over to Dr. Puca's channel, give her a subscribe, let her know I sent you, and thank you. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.